Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to my channel, Fluent Pro Hub.
Ever get that feeling where you're like, okay, yeah, I can read the words. I know what the words mean, but when I try to actually understand what it's saying, then it's trying to tell me, I don't know. It's like my brain just kind of freezes up.
Oh, yeah. No, exactly what you mean.
You know what I mean?
It's so frustrating.
It's like I'm missing something.
Totally.
And it turns out a lot of English learners feel the same way.
Really?
Yeah, we actually got a ton of questions and comments from you guys about this very thing. And they all basically boil down to the same idea. I can read English, but I don't understand it.
Huh, interesting.
Yeah, so we're going to dive into that today.
Okay, I'm game.
So we've got a bunch of really cool articles and research papers all about this whole reading without comprehension thing. And the goal is not just to figure out why it happens, but more importantly, to find some real-world solutions.
Awesome, because let's be honest, who has time for theories and lectures?
Exactly. We want actionable stuff that you can actually use starting like right now.
Love that. So where do we even begin with this whole reading comprehension mystery?
Well, the first thing we got to do is understand why this happens in the first place. Why is it that we can recognize English words, but still struggle to understand what they're saying when they're all put together?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question.
Right. And, one of the things that our sources kept bringing up is this idea that our brains can get really good at recognizing words in isolation. It's almost like a matching game. You see the word cat, it's cat. You see the word dog, it's dog.
Okay, I get that part, but how did that affect comprehension?
Well, the thing is, just because you recognize a word doesn't necessarily mean you understand what it means in the context of a sentence or a paragraph or a whole text.
Ah, so it's like I might know all the ingredients for a cake, but that doesn't mean I know how to actually bake it.
Exactly. One of the sources actually uses a food analogy. They say it's like you can recognize all the individual ingredients in a dish, but if you don't know how they're combined and cooked, you won't understand the final flavor.
That makes total sense.
Right. And the sources give a perfect example to illustrate this. They use the sentence, "Despite his reluctance, John acquiesced to the request."
Okay, so I'm guessing most people probably recognize at least some of those words.
Right. You might know reluctance, you probably know request, and maybe you've even seen acquiesce before.
Yeah, but put them all together and it's like suddenly my brain just shuts down.
Exactly. And that's because you're missing context. When we read in our native language, we're constantly drawing on this huge web of background knowledge, cultural understanding, linguistic intuition, all that stuff. But in a new language like English, that web is still under construction.
Right. So even if I know what the individual words mean in that sentence, I might not understand the nuances of John's feelings or the implications of him acquiescing to something.
Exactly. Without those contextual clues, the sentence is just a bunch of words that don't really mean anything together.
It's like having all the pieces of a puzzle, but not knowing how they fit together.
Exactly. And speaking of things not fitting together, another major roadblock that the sources talk about is this tendency to translate everything directly.
Oh, yeah. I used to do that all the time.
I think we all do it at first. It's like a natural instinct.
Yeah, when I first started learning English, I would try to translate every single word in my head.
It's totally understandable.
But it doesn't really work.
No, it doesn't, because languages aren't just collections of words. They're complex systems with their own unique rules and nuances.
Right, and that's where things like idioms and figurative language really trip us up.
Oh yeah, the sources actually give a great example of this. They use the phrase, "She was over the moon when she got the job."
Wait, so is she literally on the moon?
No, not at all. But if you're translating word for word, that's kind of the image you get.
A woman floating in space with a job offer. That's hilarious.
Yeah, and that's the problem with direct translation. You lose the humor, the emotional impact, the real meaning.
So what does it actually mean?
It means she was super happy, ecstatic, thrilled.
Oh, okay. That makes a lot more sense.
Right. So direct translation can actually prevent us from understanding what's really being said.
It's like trying to understand a joke by looking up each word in the dictionary.
Exactly.
All right.
And then on top of that, you've got another layer of complexity, which is that English sentence structure can be totally different from what we're used to in our native languages.
Oh, yeah. Word order can be a real pain.
It can, and the sources actually point out that this can be a major stumbling block for a lot of English learners.
Like how?
Well, think about a simple question like, have you ever been to London?
Okay, so what's so tricky about that?
Well, for someone whose native language typically puts the verb after the subject, starting a sentence with have might feel really weird and confusing.
Yeah, I guess I never thought about it that way.
And even though they might know all the individual words, the unfamiliar structure can just throw them off.
It's like suddenly the rules of the game have changed.
Exactly. Your brain has to process the information in a different way, hold on to certain elements before understanding their role in the sentence.
It's like learning a whole new set of grammar rules.
Right. And finally, the sources talk about this really interesting thing, which is the role of mental visualization, or rather the lack of it, when reading in a second language.
What do you mean by that?
Well, think about it. When you read in your native language, do you ever find yourself picturing the scene, the characters, the actions in your mind?
Oh yeah, all the time. It's like I'm watching a movie in my head.
Exactly. And that's because when you're reading in your native language, you're not just processing words. You're actually building a mental model of the situation.
That makes sense.
But the sources suggest that when we read in English, we often get so caught up in decoding the words themselves that we don't do this as much.
So it's like we're reading the words, but not really experiencing them.
Right. It's like reading a recipe without imagining the actual food.
So the words just stay abstract instead of becoming something concrete in our minds.
Exactly. Okay, so now that we have a better understanding of why reading English can be so challenging even when we know the words, let's move on to the fun part: solutions. Yeah, let's get practical.
All right, so the first solution that the sources emphasize is this idea of actively using your imagination while reading.
Okay, I like where this is going.
One of the sources actually calls it reading like a story.
So it's about treating every text like it's a novel or a movie.
Exactly. It's about moving beyond just decoding the letters and actually trying to create a mental image of what's happening.
So instead of just reading the words, I should be trying to see them in my mind.
Exactly. And this source gives this great example. They say, imagine you're reading the sentence. The little boy sprinted across the street as the bus honked loudly.
Okay, so how would I read that like a story?
Well, instead of just scanning those words, try to actually picture the scene. Imagine the little boy, how he's moving, the urgency of the situation.
And the bus honking.
Yes, imagine the loud honking of the bus.
Okay, yeah, I can see it now.
Right. So by engaging your senses like this, you're making the language more tangible, more real, and it helps the meaning stick.
It's like I'm actually there experiencing it firsthand. Mm-hmm. Exactly. And then the next strategy the sources talk about is called the chunking method. And it's specifically designed for tackling those long, complicated sentences that make our heads spin.
Oh, we need this one.
Yeah, we all do. The idea is to break down a sentence into smaller, more manageable chunks so you can process the meaning bit by bit.
So it's like divide and conquer?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they actually use our earlier example. Despite his reluctance, John acquiesced to the request.
Okay, so how would I chunk that?
Well, the source suggests breaking it down into 3 parts. First, you isolate the initial phrase, despite his reluctance, and try to understand what that means on its own, which is basically he didn't want to do it.
Okay, that makes sense. Then what?
Then you look at the main verb and subject, John acquiesced, which basically means John agreed.
And finally, to the request.
Right, which means to what someone asked.
Okay, so by breaking it down like that, the whole sentence suddenly becomes much clearer.
Exactly. It's like taking a complicated math problem and solving it step by step.
And the next solution the sources talk about is this idea of thinking in English.
Ah, yes. This one is all about shifting your internal language processing.
So instead of translating everything in my head.
Exactly. The idea is to start connecting English words and phrases directly with their meanings without going through your native language.
But how do I do that?
Well, the source gives this example. They say, imagine you're reading the sentence, the weather is unpredictable.
Okay.
Instead of immediately translating that into your native language, try to explain it to yourself in simple English, like, the weather keeps changing. I can't guess it.
Okay, so I'm basically paraphrasing it in my head.
Exactly. And by doing that, you're forcing yourself to engage with the meaning in English terms. You're not just looking for an equivalent in another language. You're actually describing the concept using English words you already know.
So it's like I'm building my own internal English to English dictionary.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the next tip is something that can really help boost your comprehension. And it's actually quite simple. It's called simultaneous reading and listening.
Okay, so I'm guessing that means reading and listening at the same time.
Exactly. And the sources suggest using things like English videos with subtitles or audiobooks with accompanying text.
So I'm basically getting the same input in 2 different formats.
Right. And this is really powerful because it engages both your visual and auditory processing.
So it's like my brain is getting double the information.
Exactly. And this can really help cement the connection between the written and spoken forms of the language.
And it probably helps with pronunciation, too.
Absolutely. Hearing the words spoken correctly can clarify their meaning, and it also helps you internalize the natural rhythm and intonation of the language.
It's like a win-win.
Exactly. And finally, the last practical solution that the sources highlight is the importance of consistent practice with a focus on what they call self-explanation.
So basically reading regularly and then explaining what I've read to myself.
Exactly. They recommend this simple exercise. Read a short paragraph or article, and then try to summarize it in your own words without looking back at the text.
So it's like I'm testing myself to see if I really understood what I just read.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And if you find yourself struggling to explain something, that's a signal to go back and read it again more carefully.
It's like being my own teacher.
Exactly. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground today. We've talked about why understanding English can be so tricky even when we know the words. And we've explored some really practical strategies to improve our comprehension.
Yeah, this has been super helpful.
I'm glad. And now to wrap things up, we have a little challenge for you, our listener.
Ooh, a challenge. I love it.
So the sources end with this sentence. The manager's decision was met with mixed reactions.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
Now we want you to take a moment and think about that sentence. What does it mean to you based on everything we've talked about today? Maybe try visualizing the scenario. Maybe try breaking it down into chunks. Maybe think about it in English without translating.
And no pressure. There's no right or wrong answer here.
Exactly. The point is to just engage with the sentence using some of these new approaches.
And hopefully this deep dive has given you some real tools to help you move from simply decoding English words to truly understanding what they mean.
Because at the end of the day, it's all about active engagement. It's not enough to just passively look at the words on the page.
Yeah.
You have to interact with them, visualize them, break them down, articulate their meaning in your own way.
And the more you do that, the more confident and fluent you'll become in English.
Exactly. So as you continue on your language learning journey, remember to keep these techniques in mind. They can really help you unlock a deeper level of understanding, not just in English, but in any new information you encounter.
It's all about training your brain to move from simple recognition to genuine comprehension.
Exactly. And on that note, we'll wrap up this episode.
Until next time, happy reading.
And happy understanding.
That's the key.
It is.
All right, catch you later.
See ya.
If you found this video helpful, let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts. If you're here for the first time, don't forget to subscribe for more engaging content to improve your English. Keep practicing and take care.